So one of the goals, like kind of the things we've been chasing for a long time is, is there a way to drive user experience using the back end, using the service tier, right? And so the goal here is to reduce the amount of service coupling or increase the rate of change in applications by somehow making it possible to make changes on the back end or somewhere. Well, they always have to be made on the back end because they're business rules, and the service tier that would actually be reflected in the UI. And so we're going to talk about an approach I saw maybe 8-10 years ago that was pretty amazing, actually. Now, of course, partway through, we kind of abandoned part of that when we got in a hurry, but it worked out really well. So the goal here is to decouple the services from the user flow. And basically, the approach we're going to take with this is services, the back-end services, all generate messages that can be used by the UI. That's pretty standard. And services generate, and those messages will be displayed, or they'll be used to drive the UI, and it'll work across different types of clients like web apps or mobile apps, those kind of thing. And the client apps will look at the messages returned and decide what they need to show, and it could even change possibly where those pieces are shown or whether or not they're paid attention to, right? And we actually implemented this in an app with like 400, it was like way more than that, thousands of fields, and it was kind of a stateful app, and it had like 30 different screens and panes across it for all the special cases. And so it was a pretty big app. For a tiny app, it probably doesn't matter, but if you end up with some kind of regulated app or a pretty large one, maybe different classes of users, then maybe this is an approach to take. So we're going to look at the standard topology, right? We have a couple of happy users out here. They're partying. I don't know. And we have different kinds of apps, a spa web client, or we might have a mobile app. Usually we'll have some kind of business process gateway. It could be a proxy. It could be, like the entry point for that thing. And then behind that, we have a set of business rule services. And then we have like these interior services that sit behind that might be CRUD services. They might be anything, AI, I don't know. I'm making stuff up now. But basically the idea is you have a multi-tiered app, and the app has a fair amount of control in it, but we also have a bunch of business rules that run on the back, and we have a moderately, like I said, multi-page or, dozens or hundreds of fields. And so how can we make that work? And so this is the standard topology. Now, in a multi-page spa or spa app, or it could be, a mobile app, let's just say we've got 4 panes, and, there's pane 1, there's pane 2A and B. So we might show one or the other based on business rules, right? We're only going to show one or the other probably. And then we'll have pane 3. And so if you look at that, basically the reason we do this is we have some kind of cascaded set of business rules, and these could be in a single page app where the panes appear and disappear, but the end result is the same. And the idea here is that we have a data model that we're filling in that's got to be, accurate. And so in this case, we have 3 submodels, right? Pane 1, we're going to do name and address. In pane 2, we're going to do debits and debts and assets, or we're going to do cosigners. I know I just picked that. Pretend this is a loan application. In pane 3, we're going to do disclaimers and signatures, right? So the idea is that we have multiple panes or multiple pages or multiple windows, and each of those is required to gather some data. And we either broke those up because we wanted the pages to be small, or because the panes have cascading rules that impact each other. Hey, I don't really care if you, I don't need to know about your mortgage if you didn't tell me there was a mortgage, right? Or whatever in this loan application. Now, the deal with this, right, is that you have a set of business services. So we have some web apps or mobile apps. We have this business process gateway. We have some business rule services. And we can either be like super integrated and we know exactly what to call, and there's like super fine-grained services and we could call those. And that can get kind of messy because it turns out if there's a bunch of paths through this, like, oh, I'm doing a secured loan, I'm doing an unsecured loan, it's a home loan, no, it's I don't know, whatever it would be, right? And it turns out that you suddenly have to be super smart to call all those services, and you tend to build aggregator services for that to reduce the numbers of calls across the wire. So in that case, basically the approach we're going to say is we're going to call more services than we need, or more business rules than we need. And we're going to take that approach, right? So at given milestones, like I get done with a pane, I may actually need multiple services in the back. So in my case, I was trying to figure out if I was going to do pane 2A or 2B, right? I'm on pane 1. Am I going to show pane 2A or 2B? It might be simple, but it turns out a lot of times there's some kind of oh, if what depending on what you put in this, it's driven by some table out of the back or government regulation, right? So what we're going to assume is that at regular intervals, multiple services will be called. Now, they may be aggregated calls from behind a business process gateway, but the idea is multiple services will be called, and all of those services are going to give out messages, and they don't know where you're at in the user interface. If they don't know where you're at in the user interface, they're going to give out messages that you may or may not expect. So we're going to call multiple rule services on regular milestones, and those messages that come back may or may not apply at any given milestone, right? So in the app we talked about before as a loan app, the last page was to do signatures and disclaimer acknowledgments, right? Initialing. And so in that case, if we ran that rule service, earlier on panes 1 or 2, right, instead of just pane 3, then we would get this, oh, signature required, and there's no signature fields on pane 1 and 2. So what we get is we end up with general purpose rule services that cost back more messages than we can use at a given place. And so the question is, what do we do about that? Instead of creating custom services, what we're going to do is we're going to create a set of, basically, and those rule services will assume that they actually operate against an entire model. And because we're in the middle of the app, the whole model hasn't been filled out yet, right? So in this case, for this loan app, we've got the name, the address, the debts, the assets, the cosigners, disclaimers, and signatures, right? Name and address, we're on pane 1, debts and assets, and cosigners, we're on 2, A and B, disclaimers and signatures are on 3. So we're going to take that model at any given point that's partially filled out, and and this could be a pretty big model, so we got to figure out how we're going to do this, really. Maybe there's big submodels. We're going to run those through the business rule services, and those are going to generate a whole bunch of messages, right? So in the case, I've got this example here, we've got 6 messages that came out of that, like at the start, right? And so then the question is, all of those messages are correct for running the business process, but they're not necessarily correct for the pane we're on. And so in that case, what we're going to do is we're going to create a filter tied to each one of the panes. And that pane filter says these are the only message. We're going to give all the messages a number. And we're going to say the only messages that matter on this pane are the ones tied to name and address, right? And so those messages, all the other messages will be filtered out. So in this case, I ended up with 6 messages coming back from the general purpose services who have no idea what our page flow looks like. And that generated 6 messages. And then the filter on the pane I'm on said that only 2 of those messages apply. The rest of the messages get tossed out, or we may store them and use them later, but more than likely we're going to toss those out. And then we'll do work on that pane 1 until those messages no longer appear that apply to pane 1. After that, only the last 4 messages would appear, right? So we cleared the 2 name message errors. We keep making changes and we send the data and we get the data back, and it turns out none of the messages on pane 1 are still showing. The other messages were ignored, and we can advance to the next pane. So what that means is the pane is clean when none of those messages still apply. So in this case, when we entered all the data on pane 1, all the messages for pane 1 that were acknowledged by pane 1 or filtered for pane 1 would have all been cleared because we entered the right data. We'll still end up with the same 4 messages, additional 4 messages that we had on the original on pane 1. And in that case, because all those are filtered out, we're going to advance to the next pane. In our case, we had dozens of messages on every page. We had hundreds of messages, and we had like a couple hundred, like 50 pages or something. And so we ended up with a ton of messages, and some messages same message would apply on multiple panes because we might have done customized panes for certain user type or certain transaction type. So the entire app becomes done and ready for like the final submit. Now we've been keeping state, maybe we stored state, but like I'm actually going to do this alone, right? And so if we could still end up with messages that don't apply. Like there could be, if this is a corporate account, these disclaimers apply. And if we know this isn't a corporate account, we never get to the corporate account page, that disclaimer set of messages would just be ignored everywhere, and we would be able to advance through all the panes that we needed, and we would end up with no messages that applied to any of the panes, even though some messages are still generated. And what that does is it lets us create UIs for different classes of users or different use cases that know what messages are going to be problems for them, right? And that is pretty cool. Like I said, we really did this, and it was really nice because none of the backend services needed to know what UI we were on. We didn't need super customized endpoint for all the panes. And so that we didn't have to bind to the UI. And then, like I said, if messages applied to the pane we were on, and like if you were a single page with multiple panes in it, messages might reappear, right? You made a change on the third pane that suddenly meant that some other decision wasn't right, and you might bring another pane back. So that was the idea, is that the app was done when the report was clean for the filtered set of messages, not that no messages were generated. Now, because this is a web app, or we're on the internet, it's a trust no one architecture, and we need to assume that the clients are compromised. And so really the back end, the UX may include a subset, filters and do all this other stuff. The service messages for completion, I'll fix that in the presentation. Anyway, and the idea is that the gateways will do those filters, and the backend services still need to run, right? You need to be able to test this and all the rules that were implemented in the front end around what data was required and stuff. If you didn't do that from the backend services, then you have this disconnect, right? And so in some cases, we will push rules to the front end to get better results, but we always need to test as if the front end has been completely compromised, and we just enter random, fuzz sets of data with pieces missing, and make sure that all the business rule services do the right thing, and that the thing stopped even if the UI is compromised. This is just a side note. And then there are two kinds of messages really that are fatal and overrideable. So really what I talked about before were all the ones that kind of get filtered into the page, and those basically block the page from advancing, or they tell us what fields to show, right? There's also a lot of times an overrideable message type. Hey, this is a horrible idea for you to do this. Are you sure you still want to do it? It's a checkbox. So essentially a warning message could either be fixed by the data being fixed, so the message is no longer generated, or by the override field. And so the user has overridden, actually probably needs to go to the backend service that says, yes, we acknowledge that this bad behavior is something we actually want. So I just want to say there's actually, you can do a whole talk on this, there's two kinds of messages typically in this. And so basically the idea is clients must pick a block or allow strategy to handle the fact that messages can be generated that are not intended for UX, because these are general purpose services, or they're facades on general purpose services. So you got to decide whether you're going to do an allow default strategy or a block default strategy. And that has impacts if new messages are generated from the back that you didn't expect. Should the UI stop, or should the UI ignore those? But that still might stop the transaction, because that edit might be considered, that validator might be considered fatal. And so the UI might let a user go through and the transaction still fails. You got to decide what to do there. And basically this allow or block default strategy really drives whether you want to release clients early and then enable them by turning on the backend services, or you're going to turn on the backend services and then support in the client. Probably the former is the way to go. And then you got to look at the service backwards compatibility strategy. So the idea here is we want to drive the UX in long-running rule-driven business processes, and we can do that without the services knowing the fields on the page through this filtering method where the different panes or pages know what messages apply to that page, and all the others are ignored and assumed to be picked up in some later process. That's it. I hope this was useful. Have a great day. Leave feedback like usual. Bye.